Nan Sowerby was 9 years old, and she ate standing up. The last of 90. The burnt heel of yesterday's loaf, gone hard at the edges, chewed in the corner of the scullery after the hall had cleared and the candles were pinched out. The new mistress of Brentmoor Hall saw it. She did not scold the child. She did not weep. She asked, instead, to see a book that no mistress at Brentmoor had ever opened. Upstairs, the long table in the staterooms groaned with fresh bread, carted in daily from the village at a price. Below stairs, the scullery and the stable were put on £0.5 a day. "The servants eat last, ma'am. It has always been the way," the housekeeper told the steward, and she said it in the mistress's hearing before 90 souls of the household. So the mistress went to the village baker and asked him for the one thing no one at Brentmoor had ever put on paper: his price. In writing. If you believe quiet people read the fine print, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments which town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far a loaf of bread can travel. Now, let me take you back. It was the spring of 1817. The hungry spring. 2 years the corn laws had held the ports shut, and the price of wheat had climbed like a fever that would not break. Bread was dear. Bread was everything. In cottages across the North Riding, a family counted the loaf the way a miser counts coin, and the workhouse doors swung on their hinges more that year than any in living memory. It was called, later, the year without a summer. The sky stayed the colour of dishwater, and the rain came sideways off the moor. Into this came Charlotte Ashworth, née Pruitt, the new mistress of Brentmoor Hall. She came by carriage up the long avenue of dripping limes, and the house rose out of the mist ahead of her. Grey stone, blank windows, a great cold building that had stood 400 years and meant to stand 400 more. Her husband was not there to meet her. Edmund Ashworth, master of Brentmoor, was away in York, tangled in a boundary suit that had already eaten a year of his life and showed no sign of letting go. So it was the steward who came down the steps to greet her. Josiah Crane. He was a neat man. That was the first thing she noticed. Neat and dry and courteous, with ink on his second finger and a black coat brushed to a shine. He bowed exactly as low as a steward should bow to a mistress, and not 1 inch lower. And he began almost at once to teach her how poor she was. "You'll forgive the plainness of your welcome, ma'am," he said, handing her down. "We keep things close at Brentmoor. These are lean years. Grain is dear as I've ever known it, and an old house eats a great deal." "So I have heard," said Charlotte. "Economies are necessary. I hope you'll not find us mean. It is only prudence." He smiled the small smile of a man explaining weather to a child. "Estate matters need not trouble you, ma'am. My office carries all of that. You've only to enjoy the house and leave the accounts to me." "How kind," said Charlotte. And that was all she said. She followed him up the steps and into the cold hall, and she let him believe he had settled the matter. Here is what Josiah Crane did not know. What none of them knew, that first grey afternoon. Charlotte Pruitt had not been raised in a drawing-room. She had been raised in a yard. Her father was a corn factor in the market town of Kirkful, a dealer in grain, and from the time she could walk, she had spent her days among sacks and scales and the smell of dust and chaff. She could plunge her hand into a sack of wheat and tell you if it had been kept dry. She could take a pinch of flour, rub it between finger and thumb, hold it to the light, and tell you what it had been cut with. She knew the assize of bread, the legal price, set by the magistrates against the price of wheat, the way other young women knew the steps of a dance. She had watched her father weigh out honesty by the ounce for 30 years, and she had learned that a ledger never lies, though the men who keep it very often do. She had married up. That was the phrase for it. A corn factor's daughter, married to the master of a great house, and everyone she met at Brentmoor took one look at her plain grey gown and her quiet manner, and decided she was ornamental. That she knew nothing, that her competence, if she had any, ran to needlework. It was the most useful mistake they could have made. On her second morning in the house, walking a corridor she had not yet learned, Charlotte passed an open door, the housekeeper's room. And on the table inside, beside a ring of keys and a pot of ink, lay a thick book bound in worn calf. The stores book, in Mrs. Fenwick's hand, the record of every ounce that came into the house and every ounce given out. The allowance book, and Charlotte, glancing in as she passed, understood in a single beat something the whole house took for granted, that this book, in all the years of Brentmoor, no mistress had ever once asked to open. She walked on. She said nothing. But she remembered the door. The housekeeper was Mrs. Agnes Fenwick, a tall woman, straight as a poker, with a face that had settled long ago into the expression of someone who has always been right and does not expect to be contradicted. She held the keys. She held the stores. She had held them through the last mistress's whole life and the mistress before that, and she ran the house below stairs as an absolute monarch runs a small, cold kingdom. She and Crane were thick as thieves. They dined together in the housekeeper's room off the good china, and what they arranged between them, the house obeyed. It took Charlotte 4 days to see the first of it. She had taken to walking the house at odd hours, not spying, a mistress may walk her own halls, but watching. Counting, she noticed things. And on the 4th evening she came down the back stair near the scullery after the servants' supper had been cleared, and she saw the child. Nan Sowerby, 9 years old, small for it, a scullery maid at the very bottom of 90. The supper was done. The others had eaten and gone, and the cook, not unkindly, only from habit, had set aside for the child what was left, the heel of yesterday's loaf, the burnt end, hard as a board. £half was the scullery's allowance for the day, and £half the child had had, and this was the last of it. Nan stood at the cold table and ate it standing, because the benches were for those who came first, and she gnawed the hard crust with the concentration of the truly hungry. Charlotte stood in the shadow of the doorway and watched, and did not let herself be seen, and she felt something turn over in her chest, slow and cold. But she did not go in. She did not gather the child up. She did not make a scene. She began, instead, to count. £half a day to the scullery, £half to the stable lads. She learned the figures the way she'd learned them in her father's yard, quietly, item by item, and she set them against what she saw upstairs, in the state rooms, where the table wanted for nothing, where fresh white bread came up soft and warm every single day, more than the family could eat, the surplus going stale and thrown to the pigs. Below, the burnt heel, chewed standing. Above, the loaf uneaten and flung to the sty. The same house, the same day, the same year of dear bread that Crane had used to greet her. She said nothing. She counted, and she waited to understand. The bread was the next thing. Every morning before light, a cart came up the avenue from the village. Silas Ogden's cart. Ogden was the Kirkville baker, a broad, easy, smiling man, and by long arrangement he supplied Brentmoor Hall with all its bread. Every loaf the household ate, high and low, came off that cart at a price paid out by the steward's office, and Charlotte, watching the cart unload one raw morning, asked a simple question of the cook. "There's a bakehouse on the estate, is there not?" "I saw the chimney." "Aye, ma'am, old bakehouse, round the back of the brewhouse. Cold this many a year, though cold?" "Why cold, when we've a granary of our own?" The cook wiped her hands and looked uncomfortable, because the answer was not hers to give. "Mr. Crane's arrangement, ma'am. It's reckoned cheaper to buy than to bake. Ogden brings it in, and there's no wages for a baker, no coals for the oven, no waste. Cheaper to buy than to bake, Mr. Crane says. Cheaper to buy than to bake." Charlotte went to look at the bakehouse that afternoon. She let herself in with a borrowed key. It was a good room. A great brick oven, swept clean, cold as a tomb. Troughs for the dough, a peel hanging on the wall, a fine bolting cloth folded on a shelf and gone stiff with disuse. This had been a working bakehouse once, and not long ago. It had fed the house from the house's own grain, and someone had let the fire go out and called it Economy. She stood in the cold room a long while. Then she went back to her sitting room, and she did something very deliberate. She sat down and she wrote a note. Civil, short, in her own clear hand. She addressed it to Mr. Crane. She asked him, mildly, as one merely curious, why the estate's own bakehouse should stand idle and cold, and the house buy in all its bread at a price, when the granary held the estate's own wheat. She signed it, and she sent it to his office. It was the first warning. And she kept a copy. Crane's answer came the next day, verbal, brought up by a footman. Mr. Crane's compliments, and the arrangement had been found most economical, and the mistress was not to trouble herself with such dry matters. The bakehouse was better cold. He was sure she understood. She understood. She understood better than he could have dreamed. But she only sent down her thanks, and she said no more, and Crane went to his supper that night well satisfied that the new mistress had asked her one foolish question and been gently put in her place. He told Mrs. Fenwick so, over the good china. And Mrs. Fenwick, straight as a poker, said that mistresses came and mistresses went, but the stores book stayed in her keeping, and that was as it should be. And they poured the wine, the two of them, and the house went dark, and below them the scullery child slept on an empty stomach in a cold garret. The lean quarter came in with the turn of the season, and with it came the day the account was opened before all their eyes. It was the way of the house, Crane's way, Fenwick's way, that in every lean quarter, when the price of grain rose, the first economy made was the servants' allowance, not the state rooms, not the upper table, the scullery and the stable. Their £half was cut to something less than half, short commons, and they were told it was the times, and the times were dear, and everyone must bear it. And so, on a grey day at the very bottom of that hungry spring, the servants' hall sat down to its dinner, and the dinner was not enough. Charlotte was there. She had begun, to Mrs. Fenwick's visible displeasure, to come down at mealtimes. A mistress at the servants' dinner was unheard of, but she came, and she stood at the side, and she watched. The upper servants ate first, and ate well. Mrs. Fenwick, the steward when he chose, the butler, the lady's maid, the cook, the upper table was full. Meat on it, bread enough and more, and below them, at the long board, the lower house waited their turn, as they always waited, for the servants eat last, and when their turn came, the bread was short, thin portions of it, the scullery and the stable given least of all, and little Nan Sowerby, 9 years old, who had had short commons the day before, and short commons that morning, sat at the far end of the long board with her small hands folded, and waited for a piece of bread that, when it came, was the size of a child's fist. She never ate it. Charlotte saw the child sway, saw the colour go out of her face, grey as the sky, and Nan Sowerby fainted clean away off the bench, and went down onto the flags in a little heap, out cold from plain hunger, before the whole assembled household, before 90 souls. There was a scramble. The cook was up, the girls were up. Someone fetched water, and into that clatter, Mrs. Fenwick's voice fell cool and flat, not to the child but to Crane, who stood in the doorway, and she said it as calm as remarking on the rain. "The servants eat last, ma'am. It has always been the way." She said it in Charlotte's hearing. She meant it to be heard. It was not an apology, and it was not a shame. It was a defence, offered up plain, the way things had always been done, and therefore the way things were right. And Josiah Crane nodded, as a man nods at a settled truth, and the household lowered its eyes and got on with the business of the fainting child, because 90 people had learned long ago that this was simply the shape of the world at Brentmoor. Charlotte Ashworth did not raise her voice. She knelt down on the cold flags in her grey gown, and she gathered the child up herself, and she felt how light she was, light as a bundle of kindling, 9 years old and nothing to her, and she called for broth and had her carried to the warm by the kitchen fire. And she stayed until the colour came back into the little face. She did not shout, she did not weep, she did not accuse anyone of anything. But something had been decided in her, there on the flags, and it was as cold and as clear as the assize price of bread. The account had been opened before every eye in that hall, and she meant to close it before the very same eyes. The next morning she asked for the stores book. She went to the housekeeper's room, and she did not ask as a favour. "Mrs. Fenwick," she said, "I'll see the stores book, if you please. The allowance and the stores, this quarter and the last 4. Mrs. Fenwick stood very straight. "The stores book is in my keeping, ma'am. It always has been. No mistress at Brentmoor has ever—" "I am the mistress at Brentmoor now," said Charlotte, "and I am asking." Once there was a long, cold moment in the little room, and then Mrs. Fenwick, because in the end the keys were hers but the house was not, took the calf-bound book down off its shelf and set it on the table, and stepped back with her mouth pressed flat. Charlotte sat down and opened it, and she read it the way her father had taught her, slowly, line by line, the way you read a thing that means to fool you. It told her everything. Down every lean quarter, going back years, she followed the same hand and the same story. When grain rose, the allowance was cut, and it was always the same allowance cut first, the scullery, the stable, the lowest of the low. That was the economy. That was the prudence. That was the hard necessity of the dear years, written out in Mrs. Fenwick's neat hand, quarter after quarter, the bread taken from the mouths of children and stable lads, while the upper table never lost an ounce. And then she turned to the stores, to what the estate actually held. And there it was, in the same book, in the same hand. 40 quarters of good wheat, sealed in the estate's own granary. That spring. Charlotte sat and looked at that figure for a long time. 40 quarters. Enough to feed the whole household, high and low, full measure, through the leanest year that ever came off the moor. Sealed, sitting, untouched, while a 9-year-old child fainted off a bench for want of a fist of bread. The house was not poor. It had never been poor. Crane had met her carriage with poverty as a settled fact, and it was a lie you could weigh on a scale. The grain was in the granary. The hunger was not scarcity. The hunger was an arrangement. She closed the book. And the thing in her chest that had turned over cold on the flags of the servants' hall now went hard and quiet and certain, the way iron sets when it cools. She did not feel like weeping any more. She felt like a woman looking at a column of figures that did not add up, who has just understood exactly where the missing money went. But she did not yet have all of it. She had the hunger, and she had the grain, and she had the lie about the bakehouse. She had one thing more to find, and she went to find it in the plainest way in the world. She drove into Kirkful, to the baker's shop, and she asked Silas Ogden his price. Not spoken. She had heard his price spoken, easy and smiling, the price the office had always paid. She asked him to put it on paper. His price for 100 weight of bread, delivered to Brentmoor, in his own hand, signed, and she watched him hesitate. It was a small thing. A flicker, a broad, smiling man, asked to write down a number he had said out loud 1,000 times, and for just a moment the smile did not reach his eyes. Because a spoken price blows away on the wind. A written price stays. A written price can be set beside other numbers. And Silas Ogden, who had grown fat on this arrangement for years, did not want his number sitting still on a page where a corn factor's daughter could set it against the assize. But she was the mistress of the great house, and she was asking pleasantly, and to refuse would be strange. So he wrote it. He wrote his price, and he signed it, and he handed it across the counter with a smile he had to work at. And Charlotte thanked him and folded the paper away and drove home with it warm in her hand like the seed of a fire. That night, alone, she did the sum. She set Ogden's written price on the table. Beside it she set the assize of bread, the legal price, wheat to loaf, that the magistrates fixed and published in every market town in England, the fair price, the honest ratio she had known since she was a girl in her father's yard. And beside that she set what she knew, in her bones and her fingertips, wheat truly cost that spring, dear as it was, and the sum would not close. Ogden's price ran high, not a little high, well above the assize, well above what the bread ought to cost, even in the hungry spring, even with grain as dear as it was. There was money in that gap. A great deal of money, paid out year after year by the steward's office, above the honest price. For bread the estate could have baked from its own sealed grain for a fraction of the cost. The gap was too wide to be Ogden's honest profit. It was too wide to be anything but a share. Somewhere in the space between the assize and Ogden's written price, a second man was being fed. And Charlotte, looking at the two numbers on her table, knew the shape of him even before she could name the figure. A shilling in the pound, she thought. A quiet man's cut. The kind of skim that hides inside a spoken price and dies the moment it is written down. She had the seed of it now. She did not yet have it whole. But she knew where to dig, and she knew it was there, and that was enough to move. She moved the next day. There was an old man who lived in a cottage on the grounds, at the edge of the kitchen gardens. Tobias Frost. He had been the estate's baker once, the man who had fired that great brick oven and fed the house from its own flour, before Crane's Economy let the fire go cold and pensioned him off. He was old now, and his hands were bent, but his eyes were sharp, and when Charlotte came to his door and asked him whether he thought he could fire the Brentmoor oven again, the old man stood up out of his chair as though 30 years had dropped off him. "Fire her again, ma'am?" he said. "I could fire her tomorrow. She's a good oven. Best oven in the Riding. It fair broke my heart to let her go cold." He looked at her, this plain grey mistress who had walked to his door. "You mean it?" "They'll not like it. Mr. Crane won't like it." "Mr. Crane," said Charlotte, "need not trouble himself with dry matters. Can you sift, Tobias? Can you tell me if the flour's sound?" The old man almost laughed. "Can I sift? Ma'am, I've a bolting cloth I've kept oiled these 10 years for no reason I could name." "Aye, I can sift." "Then I'll want the oven lit," said Charlotte, "and I'll want the granary opened, and I will keep the store's book myself. From this day." That was the decision. That was the thing that could not be taken back. She sent for the granary keys, and she took the calf-bound store's book off the housekeeper's shelf and into her own keeping, over Mrs. Fenwick's cold and silent fury, and she gave the order that the bakehouse chimney, cold these many years, should smoke again. And 2 mornings later, before it was light, it did. Old Tobias Frost fired the great oven, and the estate ovens were lit again for the first time in years. And the warm brown smell of it drifted across the yards where the servants slept. And Charlotte went herself to the granary and had a sack of the sealed wheat brought out, the good grain, the 40 quarters, sealed so long it might have spoiled, and she had it milled, and she stood in the cold bakehouse and took her father's own flour sieve down off the shelf, the fine bolting cloth stretched on its ring, and she sieved the flour herself into the light, the way she had done 10,000 times as a girl in Kirkful, and she rubbed a pinch of it between her finger and her thumb and held it up to the grey dawn coming through the window. It was sound, sweet and dry and sound, every ounce of it. Not spoiled, not short, not scarce. Good wheat, kept safe, held back from 90 hungry people through a whole dear spring while a child fainted for the want of it. And Charlotte Ashworth stood in the warm bakehouse with her father's sieve in her hands and the estate's own good flour falling clean and white through the cloth, and she understood, past any doubt now, that not 1 hour of the hunger at Brentmoor had ever been necessary. She had the grain, she had the oven, she had the written price folded in her pocket, and the store's book in her own keeping, and the shape of the missing money clear before her. She had, quietly, taken hold of the whole thing. But the neat, dry man in the black coat did not yet know it. He was down in his office, settling his accounts, certain as ever that a merchant's daughter married up would never in her life read a ledger. He had smelled the wood smoke on the morning air, and he was already reaching for his pen to ask, in his cold and courteous way, exactly who had given leave to light the bakehouse fires. He came up from his office at the middle of the morning with the note already written. She saw the paper in his hand before she saw his face. Crane held it out to her across the table in the small parlour, folded once, sealed with his own ring. Courteous, cold, the way he did everything. "A small matter, ma'am," he said. "I would not trouble you, but I find the bakehouse has been lit." "It has," Charlotte said. She did not look up from her sewing. She let the needle go through the cloth and pulled the thread its full length before she spoke again. Her father had taught her that. "When a man wants you flustered, be slow. Old Frost is at the oven," she said. "You remember Frost?" "I do." A pause. "The estate baker. Pensioned these 10 years. Then he is glad of the work. He tells me the oven draws as well as it ever did." She snipped the thread. "I have taken an interest in the kitchens, Mr. Crane. A lady must have something to fill her hours while her husband is in York." She watched him weigh it. She could see the small machine of him turning behind his eyes. A wife who sews and bakes little loaves for her own amusement. A wife playing at housewifery. It was a thing he understood. It was a thing he could file away and forget. "The expense," he began. "Is mine," she said, "from my own portion. You need not enter it in any book of yours." And there it was. The word book, laid down gently, watched for the flinch. There was none. He did not know she had the store's book. He did not know she had been in the granary. He thought a sack of flour and an old man's wages was the whole of it. He bowed, the neat half-bow he gave to things beneath his notice, and he went back down to his accounts, and Charlotte let out a breath she had held since he came through the door. Relief, but only a little. She had bought herself a week, no more. A man like Crane smelled smoke and remembered it. She spent that week at the long deal table in the bakehouse with a stub of pencil and the backs of old letters, and she did the sum that no one at Brentmoor had ever troubled to do. She did it the way she had done it in her father's yard, in the smell of chaff and flour, with the great scales creaking behind her. 40 quarters of wheat in the granary. She knew to the penny what wheat like that was worth, even in a dear year, even in this dear year with the corn laws holding the ports shut 2 seasons running. She knew the yield of it, how much flour came off a quarter through the mill, how much bread came off the flour through the oven. She had watched it 1,000 times. Then she took Ogden's carted price, what Brentmoor paid the village baker for every loaf that came up the drive on his wagon. She multiplied it out across a year of feeding 90 mouths, and she set the 2 figures side by side. The estate's own grain, milled at the estate's own mill, baked in the estate's own oven, by a baker already pensioned and glad of the wage, that bread fed the whole household, upper table and scullery alike, and left grain over. It cost less than half of what Ogden's wagon brought. Less than half. And Ogden's bread was the meaner loaf, short-weighted, baked from flour a grade down from what sat sealed in Brentmoor's own store. She sat back and looked at the 2 columns in the grey light. It had always been cheaper to bake. That was the whole of it. There had never been an economy in buying. The economy ran the wrong way. Every loaf that came up on Ogden's cart cost the estate more than a loaf baked at home would have cost. And somebody had chosen that, year on year, through a whole hungry spring, with a child on £0.5 a day. Somebody had paid more, on purpose, to feed the house worse. You do not pay more to get less by accident. You pay more to get less, because a piece of the more is coming back to you in the dark. She knew the shape of the missing money now. She only did not yet have it in his own hand. So she went looking for his hand. Lady Day was coming. The quarter's rents, the quarter's reckonings. Crane would settle the village accounts and the bread contract with them, and he would enter what he entered in the estate books that the master saw. But a man keeps two sets of figures when he skims, the ones he shows, and the ones he needs to know his own share is right. She did not steal them. She did not need to. She was the mistress of the house, and the accounts of the house were hers to call for while the master was away, and Crane, in his certainty, had never thought to keep them from a wife who sewed. She sent Mrs. Fenwick's own second girl down with a civil message. The mistress would see the village ledgers to acquaint herself, being new. They came up. And Charlotte, who had read her father's books since she was Nan's age, went through Crane's page by page against Ogden's written price folded in her pocket, and it did not take her long. There it was. Small, regular, a shilling in the pound across the bread contract, quarter after quarter, 10 years of it, in Crane's own dry, upright hand. Ogden charged the hall above the assize. Crane paid it without a murmur, and a shilling in every pound of the overcharge came back to the steward's office, and the two of them split a hungry house between them and called it the price of dear grain. A shilling in the pound. It sounds like nothing. Say it aloud and it sounds like nothing. But a shilling in the pound across 10 years of feeding 90 souls is a small fortune skimmed off the top of other people's bread. It is a child's fainting. It is a burnt heel eaten standing up, last of 90, in a cold scullery. It is that, turned into money and carried quietly out a side door. She had it now. All of it. The store's book showing the servant's allowance cut first every lean quarter, the granary full the whole time. Ogden's price on paper. The assize to set it against, and the commission, in Crane's own hand, the crown on top of the whole rotten thing. She had warned him once, in writing, and been ignored. She had the note's copy. She had asked, plainly and on paper, why the bakehouse stood cold when grain sat in the stores, and he had not troubled to answer. 2 warnings, both on record. She was a careful woman. She wanted the paper to stand up in front of witnesses, and it would. But she did not accuse him. Not yet. She did one thing first, and it was the thing that turned the house. Lady Day came, and by the mistress's order, that evening, the meal in the servants' hall was served in a new fashion. The bread came up from the estate's own oven, warm, the crust still ticking as it cooled, the smell of it filling the hall so that men who had eaten short for a year lifted their heads like animals at water, and it was carried, by Charlotte's word, to the lowest table first, to the scullery, to the stable, to the boot boys and the turnspit girls and the ones who had always eaten last. Nan Sowerby, 9 years old, sat at the very foot of the lowest bench, where she had always sat, waiting for the heel and the leavings, and a whole warm loaf was set down in front of her, and a knife beside it, and she was told to cut first. The child did not understand. She looked up the hall to where the upper servants sat, the ones who ate before her, always, every day of her small life, and they had nothing yet on their board. Their table was bare, and hers was not. "Go on, love," Charlotte said. She stood at the head of the hall, and she said it plain, so all 90 heard. "Cut your bread. You eat first tonight. All of you at this end. First." Nan cut the loaf. Her hands shook. She was so used to eating what was left that the front of the loaf, the whole soft, unbroken front of it, seemed to belong to someone else. And she put a piece in her mouth, warm, sound, sweet estate wheat, off her own master's ground, and she began to cry while she chewed, silently, the way children cry when they have learned not to make a noise about it, and up and down the lower tables the others ate. And the upper tables sat and watched the scullery fed before them, and understood, slowly, that something at Brentmoor had turned over in the night. Mrs. Fenwick stood by the door with her keys at her waist and her face white. She said nothing. There was nothing in her code for this. The order of the tables was the order of the world, and the mistress had just stood it on its head, calmly, without raising her voice, and the world had not fallen in. From that night the house was Charlotte's, not by the title, by the bread. A man will follow the hand that feeds him before he follows the name over the door, and 90 people had just learned whose hand it was. Crane heard of it within the hour, and Crane, at last, was afraid. He did what a cornered clerk does. He reached for his pen, the same cold courtesy, and he wrote to the master. He wrote to Edmund Ashworth in York, where the boundary suit still held him, and he wrote that the new mistress was ruining Brentmoor, that she had thrown over the settled economies of the estate, that she had lit fires that cost money, and pensioned Baker back on the books, and was baking bread at a loss out of a lady's whim, and feeding the servants like guests, and turning the household upside down while the master's back was turned. Extravagance, he called it. A want of sense. A merchant's daughter, he wrote, who did not understand that a great estate could not be run like a village shop. And Mrs. Fenwick set her name under his, as housekeeper, to say it was all true. He thought it was clever. He thought he was getting his word to the master first, before hers, and that the master would take the steward he had trusted 10 years over the wife he had married 10 weeks. He did not know that every figure he feared was already gathered in a locked box in the mistress's own room. He was fighting the fire he could see. He never looked at the flower. The letter forced the thing it meant to prevent. Edmund Ashworth read his steward's warning, and it alarmed him, as it was meant to, and he settled what he could of the suit, and he came home. He came home to set his house in order, and to see for himself what his wife had done to it. He came home to a reckoning, and he did not know it, and neither did the two who had called him. Charlotte met him in the yard. She did not weep on his neck, and she did not pour out her grievances. She took his hands, and she said only that she was glad he had come, and that there was a matter of the accounts he must see settled, and that she would ask him to hear it before the whole household, in the great hall, that evening. All of it. Together, Edmund frowned. It was an odd request, but he had learned, in 10 weeks of marriage, that his quiet wife did not ask for odd things without a reason, and he said yes. So they came to the great hall that evening. All of them. The 90, ranked as they always ranked, the upper servants and the lower, Mrs. Fenwick with her keys, and Josiah Crane in his black coat with his hands folded and his account of things ready on his tongue. Silas Ogden had been sent for from the village and stood by the door, twisting his hat, not knowing why. The master sat at the head of the long table, and on the long table, laid out in the candlelight where the whole hall could see, were 3 things: the store's book, open, a single-folded paper, opened flat, and a second ledger, Crane's own, open to a marked page, and beside them, on the dark wood, her father's flour sieve, the fine bolting cloth on its ring. Set there, like a 4th witness. Charlotte stood behind the 3 things. She did not raise her voice. She never, in the whole of it, raised her voice. "My husband has been told," she said, "that I am ruining Brentmoor, that I have been extravagant in the kitchens. Mr. Crane wrote it to him in York. Mrs. Fenwick set her name to it. I would like to answer it here, before the house, because it concerns the house." She laid her hand on the first thing. "This is the store's book. It is kept in Mrs. Fenwick's hand. It records what the household is allowed to eat. I have read it, quarter by quarter, 10 years back. and in every lean quarter, when grain was dear, the first thing cut, always, without fail, was the servant's allowance, the lowest first, the scullery to £0.5 a day. She turned a leaf, and in every one of those same quarters the estate's own granary held good sealed wheat. 40 quarters of it stood there this spring, sound and sweet, while a child in this house fainted at that table for the want of bread. A sound went through the hall. She let it settle. That is the first thing. Now the second. She touched the folded paper. This is the price the village baker charges Brentmoor for its bread. In his own hand. I asked him to write it down, which no one here had ever done. Ogden, by the door, went the colour of ash. I have set it against the assize of bread from the market town, the lawful price sworn by the assize men that every honest baker in the Riding must keep to. And Brentmoor's bread runs well above the assize. Loaf for loaf, we have paid more than the law allows any baker to charge. For years. She let that settle too. Then she laid her hand on the third book, Crane's own, and she did not take it off again. And this is why. This is Mr. Crane's account of the village dealings, in Mr. Crane's own hand. And here she turned the ledger so the candlelight fell on the marked page, quarter by quarter, 10 years of it, is a shilling in the pound, coming back off the bread to the steward's office. The baker charged above the law. The steward paid it without a word. And they divided the difference between them, and let the house go hungry to do it, and told my husband the estate was poor. Silence in the great hall, the kind of silence that has 90 held breaths in it. Crane recovered first. He had 10 years of certainty behind him, and it did not fall all at once. He gave a small dry laugh, the laugh of a man among fools. "Sir," he said, turning to the master, not to her, never to her, "a lady cannot be expected to understand the purchasing of a great estate. These are complex matters. Contracts of long standing. Prices move. A shilling here reflects carriage, and risk, and the accommodation of a supplier through hard years. To a merchant's daughter it may look like 10 years, Charlotte said. He stopped. "You said prices move, Mr. Crane? Read me the entry for the last 4 quarters. She did not push the book at him. She left it where it lay. "Read your own figures aloud, to your master, and tell him they move. A shilling in the pound. Last spring, this spring, the spring before. Read them." He did not read them. He looked at the page, at his own upright hand condemning him line by line, and he found that he had nothing. The bluster ran out of him like water out of a cracked jug, all at once, and left him standing dry and grey and old in his black coat, and he shut his mouth, because there was no figure on that page that would say what he needed it to say. Charlotte let him stand in it. Then she said the thing quietly, and it went through the hall like a blade. The estate was never poor, Mr. Crane. It was only counted by a man who ate first. He was dismissed that night. Edmund Ashworth found his voice at last and used it, and Crane was turned out of the office he had held 10 years, without a character, no letter, no good word to carry to the next great house. A steward without a character is a steward no more. He gathered his coat and his pen, and he went out of the hall he had quietly robbed, and the ninety watched him go, and did not make a sound, which was its own kind of sound. Then she turned to the door, where the baker stood. Ogden had heard the whole of it, and had spent the telling looking for the way out. There was none. His price was on the table in his own writing, and there is no unwriting a thing a man has signed. "Mr. Ogden," Charlotte said, "you charged this house above the assize, and you paid the steward to look the other way. Brentmoor's contract with you is ended tonight, and the assize men in the market town will hear of your prices, the lawful men, who weigh a baker's loaf and fine him if it comes short. You will answer to them for the rest of the riding. You have served the same way." Ogden opened his mouth. He shut it. He too had nothing. He went out after Crane into the dark, and the wheel of the assize was already turning toward him, and every short weight loaf he had ever sold was on its way home to roost. Last, she turned to Mrs. Fenwick. The housekeeper stood straight with her keys at her waist, and she had one thing left. The thing that had always answered every question in this house, and she said it now. It was always the way, ma'am. Her chin was up. The servants eat last. In this house, and every house like it. It was always the way. And Charlotte looked at her, and there was no anger in it, only something very level and very final. Then the way is over, she said. That was all. The way is over. She did not shout it, and she did not soften it. The stores book, she said, would stay in the mistress's keeping now. Mrs. Fenwick might remain as housekeeper, under-accounted larder, with the mistress holding the count, or she might go. The choice was hers, but the keys to the grain were the mistress's keys henceforth, and the order of the tables was the mistress's order. And the days of eating a house thin and calling it custom were done at Brentmoor. Mrs. Fenwick stayed. Pride is one thing and a roof is another, and she was too old to start again. She kept a smaller authority after that, and a counted key, and she never again said it was always the way, because she had heard, in front of 90 people, exactly what that sentence was worth. And Edmund Ashworth, the open question, the one whose word it might have gone to, sat at the head of his own table and looked at what his wife had laid before him. The stores book, the written price, the steward's own hand, and the sieve. He picked up the sieve. He did not fully understand it, a plain kitchen thing among the ledgers. But she told him it was her father's, and that she had milled the estate's own sealed wheat, and sieved the flour through that cloth with her own hands, and found it sound, sweet and dry and sound, every ounce held back from a hungry house through a whole dear spring, for no reason but a shilling in the pound. And Edmund, who had trusted his steward 10 years, and his wife 10 weeks, looked at the flour and the loaves and the figures, and he took his wife's arithmetic over his steward's word, before the whole household. He said it plainly, so they would all know where he stood. His wife had the right of it. The house would be run her way now. The loop closed. His word went where the truth was, and the house saw it go there, and that mattered as much as any ledger. A year on, the bakehouse at Brentmoor was never cold. Come and stand in it at dawn, a year after, and you would smell it before you reached the door, the warm brown smell of the estate's own bread, baked from the estate's own grain, off the estate's own ground, by old Tobias Frost, who was not pensioned any longer, but was the estate baker again, and glad of it, with 2 girls under him learning the oven. And on the wall by the great brick oven, on a nail where the heat kept the cloth dry, hung a flour sieve, her father's sieve. It had come from a corn factor's yard in Kirkful, to the table in the great hall, to the wall of a warm bakehouse, and it hung there now like a thing that had done its work and earned its rest. Nan Sowerby was 10 by then, and you would not have known her. The pinched grey look was gone off her. She had come up round and quick and healthy on sound bread eaten every day, first and not last, and she was a proper kitchen maid now, trusted with the good crockery, and she ate among the first at every meal, because that was simply how Brentmoor ran. She did not remember, most days, that it had ever run otherwise. That is the best thing that can be said of it. The child got to forget. As for the others, a line apiece is all they need. Josiah Crane keeps a lesser man's books 2 counties off, for a smaller house and a smaller wage, and no one there leaves him alone with the grain. Silas Ogden bakes only for the village now, and to the assize, and his loaves weigh what the law says they weigh, because the law comes and weighs them. And Mrs. Agnes Fenwick keeps a smaller room and a counted key, and eats when the rest eat, and has learned in her old age that a custom is only a robbery that has gone on long enough to stop being questioned. Here is the thing the whole of it comes down to. Hunger in a rich house is never scarcity. Write that on the wall. A poor house is hungry because it is poor. A rich house is hungry because somebody has arranged it, because a shilling in the pound tastes better to a certain kind of man than the sight of a fed child, and he will count the larder short and call it the Times, and dare you to read the book. 2 houses stand at the end of this. The house that buys its bread and pays too much, and lets a stranger's wagon feed it, and never asks the price in writing, that house will always have a crane in it somewhere, quietly eating first. And the house that bakes its own, and holds its own count, and serves the smallest first because it can, because it chose to, that is a house 90 people would stand in front of a fire for. One is fed, the other is only supplied, and any servant who has known both could tell you, in the dark, which is which. So keep your own count, read your own book, ask for the price in writing. And comment the town you're watching from. I'd like to know how far a warm loaf can travel.